Hey, it's Craig. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Canadian History X early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime. The story of Jackie Robinson and his time in Canada is part of our cultural lore, so much so that it's even been turned into a Heritage Minute. I talked about the story of Jackie Robinson in Montreal a year ago, but today I have a special episode for you from my friend David, the host of the fantastic podcast Curious Canadian History. His podcast is a wonderful and well-researched show I can't recommend enough. Find it on all podcast platforms. So without further ado, let's go into the story of Jackie Robinson in Montreal.
Hello and welcome to Curious Canadian History. I'm your host, David Borys. It is impossible to deny the legendary status that Jackie Robinson has had in the game of baseball. There have been movies, songs, poetry, books, and essays about his career, and countless tributes and celebrations of his life and impact on the game. Jackie was born in Georgia in 1919, but spent most of his life growing up in Pasadena, California. By the time he went to college, UCLA, he was already a star athlete in both baseball and football. After college, he had a short stint in the Army during the Second World War before joining the Negro Baseball League. It was there that he caught the attention of Brooklyn Dodgers general manager Branch Rickey, who in turn thought Jackie would be the perfect player to break the MLB's historic color line and forever change the game of baseball. On his path to his legendary career, Jackie spent one season on the Brooklyn Dodgers minor league affiliate, the Montreal Royals. In today's episode, we deep dive into Jackie's incredible life, focusing on his one season in Montreal, how he arrived in Montreal, what his time in Montreal was like, and how that one season set him up for a legendary career. This is Season 10, Episode 9, Jackie Robinson in Montreal. For today's episode, we have brought on a guest who seems to know everything there is to know about the game of baseball. That guest is historian and author William Humber. Bill is a member of the Order of Canada and the first historian inducted into Canada's Baseball Hall of Fame. He has authored 15 books, 7 of which have been primarily focused on baseball's history in Canada. In fact, 2 have just recently been released. One of them is Tex Simone, the man who saved baseball in Syracuse, and the other is Old Ontario at Bat, baseball's unheralded ancestry. As well, he has written books on soccer, bicycling, African-Canadian athletes, winter sports, his hometown of Bowmanville, Ontario, and on the topic of urban regeneration. He has been listed in Canada's Who's Who for over 35 years. A retired Seneca Polytechnic administrator, he has been roundly recognized for his work in environmental education and approaches 50 years of community engagement. His roots in Bowmanville date back to his great-grandmother's birth there in 1860, and Bill and his wife still live there, though their grown-up children, Bradley, Daryl, and Karen, have opted for the attractions of nearby big cities. I began by asking Bill to give us some background as to the history of professional baseball's color line.
Well, it was never explicitly written. They never actually, put it down on paper to say that black players couldn't play in organized. Now, when we talk about baseball, we're talking about organized baseball, and that's the structure of the major league game, which of course includes the minor leagues. So as late as the 1880s, there had been black players who played at a major league level. The Walker brothers were famous in the American Association for such. But it became as it were, unwritten, implicit, I guess is the best word for it, policy of baseball that We will not allow this again. And it obviously reflected that post-Reconstruction era in the United States.
Hmm.
Sadly, it was one that Canadians in some measure bought into. In other words, they weren't prepared to. There's a major exception to that. That was in Quebec, where in fact black players did play in the 20s and the 30s, 1920s and 30s. But generally speaking, Canadians, at that time had become part of the structure of baseball at the minor league level, and they were prepared to go along with that policy, as it were. And of course, it lasted then well into the 20th century, to the point that when there was talk, by certain owners or players or managers that they'd like, John McGraw, for instance, said he'd like to, hire some black players to play for him. The commissioner basically said, no, you can't do that. Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis from the U.S. South was not going to tolerate and allow that to happen. And in some respects, it almost had to await his death before anyone would broach the topic of black players playing at a major league level. And of course, that was began with Jackie Robinson in 1946 in Montreal.
And that's super interesting. So Canadians are sort of buying in, in terms of professional, or not professional athletics, but organized athletics. They're sort of buying into the segregationist policies. They're buying into the what we identify as Jim Crow. Maybe
Yeah.
before we talk about Jackie Robinson, could you give us a sense of what was the nature of baseball in Canada? Were we a minor league system for the MLB, or how does that structure work at, let's say, mid 20th century?
Yeah, I in my latest book on baseball in Ontario pre 1880, I actually refer to what developed in baseball as a caste system.
Oh,
And by
interesting.
that I mean you were either major or minor league, but there was no opportunity to move between one and the other. Unlike, say, European soccer, where there is an ability to move from one tier to another. And I said to somebody last year, if to make sense of this, you have to understand that English soccer, for instance, has four levels, from the Premier League down to what they call League Two now, but essentially four levels. Below that is what they call their national system. And Luton Town were actually in the national system until about 10 years ago and began moving up. And last year, not this year, they've fallen out of it. They were in the Premier League. And I said, the best example I can give to you of that happening here would be if a team in the Intercounty League, say the Hamilton Cardinals, rose up through the ranks and suddenly found themselves playing at Major League Baseball level. Well, that never happened. That would never happen in North America. We don't have that kind of system. And as a result, the major leagues pretty well by the 1880s spoke to what baseball was going to be, at least at that organized level. And Canada, Toronto at least had an opportunity to make it into the major leagues. Albert Spalding, who obviously was a great player in his time and went on to found a sporting goods store for which or empire, as it were, that he's better known for, actually was a big booster of Toronto in the 1880s coming into the major leagues. And Toronto felt, well, we're not really ready for it. We don't know if we have well, by not being ready for it in the 1880s, they had to wait almost a century for it to
Yeah.
finally happen in Ontario, at least, and in Toronto in 1977. So it was kind of a top-down structure with no movement possible between any of those levels, and we were always, until the Expos came along in '69, we were always at a minor league level. The only exception to that, I argue, is that London and Guelph, who started as members of the International Association in 1876, had aspirations, and that league was probably comparable to a major league. It was certainly a reasonable rival to the National League. It didn't last, and in some ways, history is written by the victors, and in this case, the victors were the National League and the organized baseball system that came along after that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It's a very, very, very good understanding. And so by the time we get to the mid 20th century, or let's say by the time we get to sort of just the immediate post war period, there's teams. So does Montreal has a feeder team to the Dodgers, correct?
Correct.
And does Toronto have a feeder team as well?
Toronto was a kind of funny kind of situation. They would occasionally be a feeder team. For instance, many of the players on the Toronto Maple Leafs in the late 40s were part of the Whiz Kids Philadelphia Phillies team, which amazingly won the pennant in 1950 and went on to lose the World Series. Um, Toronto then was purchased in 1952 by Jack Kent Cooke, who, of course, his later fame was, owning the Washington, now Commanders or whatever they're called.
Yeah,
And
Commanders.
of course, the Los Angeles Lakers basketball team,
Wow.
another weirdly named team because Los Angeles Lakers were originally from Minneapolis, where
Right.
lakes made sense. They didn't make
That's
as
right.
much sense in Los Angeles. Nevertheless, he owned the Maple Leafs in 1952, and he liked to go independent. He liked to get a ball player who maybe had not made it at the major league levels. Rocky Nelson was a classic example of that, but was a brilliant player at the minor league level. And then he would sell him at a greatly increased profit back to a major league team, which in fact he did with Nelson. He sold him to the Pittsburgh Pirates, who with Nelson in the lineup won the 1960 World Series over the New York Yankees. So after that, Toronto baseball was in significant decline in the 1960s. Cook sold his ownership, moved to Los Angeles, made the famous comment about Los Angeles that hockey would be a great thing there because there were 2 million expat Canadians living there. And then he discovered that the 2 million expat Canadians were living there because they hated hockey and didn't show up for his games. That was his argument. But in its latter years, the Toronto Maple Leafs were an affiliate of the Boston Red Sox. And many of those players went on to be part of that again, near what they called their impossible kind of dream in 1967. So there was off and on kind of major league affiliation for Toronto.
Was so when we look at 1946, is Montreal the one city that has a club with the most direct affiliation to Major League Baseball, or is there anywhere else in Canada that has a club as sort of directly connected to a club like Montreal was?
Um, there were teams there was, for instance, a what they called the Cape Breton Colliery League, which was a D league in the 1930s and was essentially owned by the St. Louis Cardinals. They
Oh,
would
wow.
not many players made it from the D level up to the eventual major league level, but there certainly was, that opportunity there. The intriguing thing about the Montreal franchise is that they almost left town in 1934, 35 in the midst of the Depression. And it was only because they had a savior who invested the money he'd made in his gas stations in Quebec that saved the franchise. And he subsequently died, and his death changed Canadian history. Any idea who that was?
No, I don't.
Okay, it was Charles Joseph Emile Trudeau. And he put the money up to save the Montreal Royals franchise from moving out of
Unbelievable.
Montreal to the United States, but went to spring training in 1935, caught the flu, which led to pneumonia, a heart attack, and death. And as a result, his 15-year-old son was left bereft of a father. And that 15-year-old son, of course, was Pierre Trudeau. And as they say now, you know the rest of the story.
Absolutely.
But by 1940, the team was still on kind of shaky grounds. And the Brooklyn Dodgers, and particularly I think Branch Rickey and others, saw this as, let's make this our team. It's close to New York City. We can get players in and out if we need to. We can send them to Montreal. They can come from Montreal to us. Let's put a financial stake in the water, as it were, for the Montreal Royals, and so they bought a half interest. So the interesting thing about that Montreal team is that its executive was largely made up of either Brooklyn Dodgers or French Canadian businessmen. It was really kind of deeply invested in the Quebecois francophone community of Montreal. It wasn't a kind of an outsider team that somehow played and hoped for fans to come. It really had a kind of a particularly distinct role. In fact, apparently one of the first ever broadcasts on French language television in Montreal in 1952 was a Montreal Royals baseball game. And it got
Mhm.
higher ratings than anything else they were showing on TV at that time. So that kind of gives you a sense of, what Montreal's place was in the Dodger empire, as it were.
That's fascinating. I think it's so interesting that the Dodger Empire, as you state, has this francophone connection. I think that's something that a lot of Canadians just simply wouldn't understand or wouldn't know. I think that's so fascinating. Let's shift gears to Jackie.
Yep,
Give us a sense of his background. Where's he
sure.
from? Who's his family like? Where's he born? How did he get into baseball? What's his early years like? Give us sort of a brief bio.
Yeah, he was born just at the end of the First World War in Georgia, but shortly after his father left, and so his mother and the five kids picked up and moved to California. They moved to Pasadena, and he actually had what for a black kid in those days was a somewhat normal upbringing. California was a lot more and continues to be a lot more liberal than many parts of the United States, certainly a lot more liberal than the Georgia of the 1920s and 30s that he could have grown up in. His brother Mac was a great athlete who finished second to Jesse Owens in the 1936 Olympic Games in the
Oh wow.
200-meter dash. Jackie eventually went to UCLA, and he was in effect a sport star. In fact, probably his greatest sport was football. And had there been a NFL comparable to what there is today, there was professional football, but had there been something comparable today, he probably would have ended up playing football for his entire career. He was also a great basketball player and track athlete as well. He did go into the army during the Second World War, and there was an event that happened on what was supposed to be an integrated bus line where he was told to get to the back of the bus. He objected vociferously, and it eventually resulted in an initial court martial. That court martial was later rescinded, and he left the military without fighting in Europe, which he would have done had that probably not occurred. He played a bit of football. He played a bit of baseball with the Kansas City Monarchs. He wasn't necessarily the best player in Negro League baseball, as it was called in those days. Josh Gibson probably was. Satchel Paige was certainly, a star of that era. But he was young. He, when he met with Branch Rickey in 1945, it's a famous story that it may be apocryphal, but there's a lot of things that are history or apocryphal that are great
Yes,
stories.
absolutely.
He was told, how would you, react to negative or racist comments? And he implied, well, what are you suggesting that I should be less a man? And Ricky's comment supposedly was, no, I want you to be more. I want you to, have the guts and the ability to withstand that kind of attack and play baseball and win them over through what you're able to do on the field. So that being the conditions, Ricky said, okay, we're going to send you to Montreal and you're going to play AAA baseball with the Montreal Royals.
So, give us a sense of his time in Montreal. It was one season, is that correct?
That's correct.
So, I mean, there's so much I want to know about his life in Montreal.
Yeah,
Let's start with the baseball aspect, and then maybe we can move to more like his day-to-day life. But
sure.
as a baseball player, when he goes to Montreal, how does he do? What's going on there?
Well, he arrives in a city which, if one knows anything about Canada from that era, one knows that Montreal, relative to the rest of the country, was what, one writer has called an open city. Uh, and by that I mean there were illegal gambling dens all over the place. Bars were open to 2 in the morning, and but anybody said, well, if it once goes beyond two, who cares? There were what were called blind pigs, where people were running bars in their own houses and staying open all night. Brothels paid off the cops to stay away from them. There was a famed Lily St. Cyr, an American stripper, who drove, people would come from Toronto just to see this woman take her clothes off. I mean, and the old joke about Toronto in those days was I spent a week in Toronto last Sunday. So Montreal was seen as kind of this, kind of, wow, there's things that are happening in that city that can't be seen anywhere else. And I think what that means is that Robinson's arrival wasn't this great shock to the people. I mean, it was just there was a small black population in Montreal. They lived in the Saint Antoine Street area.
Mhm.
There were jazz clubs that were owned by black entrepreneurs. Louis Armstrong and Joe Louis, the boxer, were said to be regular visitors to the city. So it was not an uncommon thing. And of course, Rachel Robinson always spoke highly of the reception that they received when they first came to Montreal. The first place they went to rent, the French Canadian family rented it to them. They expected to have to go to a dozen places before they got a spot. Not only did she rent a place for them, but she said if you need linen and other cutlery and other things, you've just arrived, you may not have any of that kind of stuff. Maybe, I'll make it available to you. Not a problem. Now, the other side of that coin, and there is another side of it, of course, is that blacks were often, forbidden to go into uh, nightclubs or hotels. Their population was small, but they were still restricted in that. But it was a kind of a minor restriction, shall we say, relative to the larger openness of the city.
And once he starts playing baseball, what's his experience like? Does he do well with the team? Does he do well enough to get called up? Because I know eventually he will be called up. But is this? I guess because one of the big questions
Yeah.
is this performative in terms of let's break the race barrier, or is Jackie earning his way up to the majors? And I would love to know more about his season there.
Well, he was the star of the league. I don't, I,
Okay.
I believe at the end of the season, it wasn't even the MVP, but that may have reflected more on the strangeness of who gets to vote for MVP awards. He was a star almost from the beginning. Um, in Florida, it was very hard for them to find games to play for the Royals because Florida had such restrictive segregation. Um, so he would get in the odd game, but it was really only when he got back to Montreal that he was able to play on a daily basis. And when Montreal went up, it was common for Montreal and Toronto, for that matter, to go on the road at the start of the season. April is not the best month for
No.
playing baseball in Canada, particularly in a place like Montreal. So the owners of the Jersey City team and the Baltimore team said to Branch Rickey and the Dodgers, "Would you mind not bringing Robinson with you? We're just not sure the kind of disruption that that's going to cause." And Rickey basically told them where to go and took Robinson, and they went to Jersey City. And it's a famous kind of story. Robinson, one of the first games he ever played, hit a home run against Jersey City. And as he's reaching home plate, George Shotgun Shuba of the Montreal Royals held out his hand to shake Robinson's hand. And it's been a moment so immortalized that Shuba's hometown of Youngstown, Ohio, has created a statue of that very moment of
Wow.
Shuba reaching out his hand to shake Robinson's hand to say, "You're one of us, and thanks for what you did for us." So he was a star. I mean, almost immediately led the league in a whole bunch of categories. And so the obvious question is, well, wait a minute, why didn't he get called up to the Dodgers? Well, I think Ricky's approach was, look, this is going to be shattering enough for Major League Baseball perhaps to see this star baseball player. Let's give him a whole year in Montreal. Let's let the word of his skill and his talent, reach the kind of major league level. Let's let him kind of gain some peace, as it were, in the city. And of course, he went on to lead the Montreal Royals not only to the Governor's Cup, which was the top cup awarded in the International League, but that year they had a little World Series, and they were playing Louisville in the American South, and the American South did not respond kindly to Jackie Robinson. And so the Montreal fans were irate when they returned to Montreal, and Robinson led them to the little World Series title. So he was a hero, to Montrealers for that entire season. And I think Ricky's attitude was, let's start afresh in 1947. We'll kick off the season in Florida. I think they went to Cuba actually in 1947, just to avoid any of those problems in Florida. And let's kick off the season with Robinson right from day one, opening day.
You know what the story you just told just it kind of gives me goosebumps because in many ways there's such an incredible tale of Montreal just really welcoming this person in and welcoming him into the city, and not that it was perfect like you've identified. We're not saying that everybody in the city was sort of willing to accept a black man in the midst, but it does sound like the fans of the Montreal Royals were absolutely embraced him as one of their own, and I think that's so incredible. A year before and arguably he wasn't embraced in '47 by many people in Major League Baseball, but here he is being embraced by Montreal, before he sort of shatters this color barrier. And you mentioned one of the things I'm interested in is that you mentioned that they would travel to the south. Was this something that complicated Montreal's schedule, that he would be sort of rejected by all these teams? I mean, how does he get all these records when he can't even play some of these times? I'm wondering if you could unpack that a little more.
Sure. He could play in the International League games regardless of the location.
Okay.
But the most southern city in the International League in those days was Baltimore in Maryland.
I
So there
see.
wasn't
Okay.
later days in the International League would have teams in Florida, would have teams in Atlanta, etc. Well, it was essentially a Northeastern league.
Okay.
Syracuse was in the league, Buffalo, Rochester. Not to say that he was well received there. In fact, Robinson would later claim that he received the worst reception in, of all places, Syracuse, New York. And it's kind of hard to tell why that would have been. But nevertheless, the Dodgers' attitude and the Royals' attitude was going to play regardless. So in many ways, his ability to kind of outshine the nature of the places he went was reflected on his desire to kind of show them up. One of the intriguing things I think about his place in Montreal is that this is a period when Quebecois are beginning to kind of come out of their shell, for want of a better term.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're beginning to think of themselves now as a people apart, a people separate that's under largely the control of the Anglo-Canadian businessmen. And so you have André Laurendeau in 1948 writing that Quebecois leaders like Duplessis and Camillien Houde, the mayor of Montreal, were what he referred to as the Negro King. And what he meant by that is they were comparable to leaders in African colonies owned by the British, who were allowed to kind of boss around their own people. But if they ever disrupted the British, way of doing things, they were in deep trouble. And of course, we have Pierre Vallières, who writes Negre Blanc d'Amérique, which is, grossly translated. And indeed, the title of the book is The White N-Words, of America.
Right.
I mean, you don't even want to say it anymore, the title of that book, but that was the way the book appeared in the bookstores and, on shelves. And, Vallières argued that blacks, and he never mentions, I don't think, Jackie Robinson, but basically he's saying blacks were comparable to French Canadians. They were treated as second-class citizens. I don't think it's an analogy that is entirely, appropriate. French Canadians were never, slaves in the same sense as blacks. They weren't barred from certain, washrooms. They could marry outside the French Canadian population.
Right.
Many of them
Totally.
married Irish
Absolutely.
Catholics, etc.
Yep.
So I think it's an imperfect comparison, but it is symptomatic, I think, of an attitude that at least some have claimed, allowed that French Canadian family who rented, space to the Robinsons to say, well, they aren't any different from us. What's the problem here? Let's just give them a place to live.
That's phenomenal. What an interesting cultural connection that there's sort of this recognition of one in these two groups. I find that fascinating. But I do agree with you. I think that it's an imperfect comparison, but it's certainly valuable as a historian, as historians, to
Yes.
understand that that's what they see in Jackie Robinson. They kind of see someone of themselves, which I think is, I would argue, I wonder where on the planet at that time a white person would recognize in Jackie Robinson a similar situation. I find that to be so interesting culturally.
Well, nowhere probably in North America.
Certainly.
Um, Certainly, one could argue in parts of Europe, Paris, wherever, blacks were accepted. But, and I think there's a big but that goes there, they were a very, very small part of the population.
Indeed.
So there's a Canadian boxer, Larry Gaines, who was born in Toronto in 1900, ends up boxing in Paris in the 1920s and becomes a great buddy of Ernest Hemingway. And Hemingway devotes an entire chapter to him in the longer version of A Movable Feast. It kind of got excised out of the earlier book. But in looking at it, historically, you'd say, yes, there was such a small part of the population. There's a famous story that Richard Wright, the noted American writer of Black Boy, which came out in 1945, wanted to go to Paris to kind of, live in that kind of more equal environment. But it was the immediate post-war period, and he couldn't book passage to Paris, so he chose as his second option going to Quebec, de Lorient, and
Yes.
he he lived there, and he wrote a famous letter to Gertrude Stein, who was based in Paris, and said something to the effect of, in Quebec, I can live with the earth rather than in New York, where I have to live against the earth. And it really kind of reflected the perception, at least among, at least a black intellectual like Wright, that he could, flourish in that particular part of the world.
That's so fascinating. Do we, in your research, in your time, and you've studied this, and for our listeners, I mean, you've studied this for so long. You're clearly an expert on not just baseball, not just Jackie Robinson, but baseball as a whole in Canada. Do you get any sense of Jackie Robinson's personal reactions to Montreal? Is there bars he liked? Is there anything he that he says about the city that you think he was attached to?
Um, the sense I have, and most of what he or Rachel Robinson wrote was long after the fact. It appears they lived a pretty quiet and somewhat restricted life in Montreal. They did hang out with there was a guy named Sam Moulton, who was a noted Jewish writer, who would take them to certain clubs and certain places to meet, with people who would be open-minded in their company. But it doesn't appear that he made it much of an attempt to kind of, see all of Montreal or to experience all of Montreal. Um, and intriguingly, the Montreal Alouettes had just integrated their lineup in the Canadian Football League with a guy named Herb Trawick, who Robinson knew. And the Montreal Alouettes approached Montreal Royals and the Brooklyn Dodgers and said, the baseball season ends in, the end of September. Our football season goes into November, December. How about Jackie playing for the Montreal Alouettes or alongside his buddy Herbie Trawick? And the Brooklyn Dodgers said, "No way. We're
Oh
not
wow,
we're not
that's
taking any
incredible.
risks, with this guy coming up to see us next year." So as I say, there were those odd, moments of opportunity. You know, I mean, it's a really interesting place, Quebec. I mean, you have the Aussie and Herbie Carnegie and Manny McIntyre a few years later, an all black line playing with Quebec Aces in the hockey. You had integrated baseball teams in Quebec in the 1930s in the provincial league, which was outside the orbit of organized baseball. Chappie Johnson's Colored All-Stars, an all-black barnstorming team from the U.S., actually played in a Quebec provincial league in the 1930s. So you have, a lot of these kind of, examples, and you almost, wish that there were stories about encounters between those various athletes. In fact, I would argue to somebody that there's a great piece of fiction that could be written about Richard Wright coming through Quebec in late 1945 and meeting Branch Rickey in a train station in Montreal and having a conversation about why this would be a great place for Robinson to play. And no, it's purely a piece of fiction, I would argue. But that's what fiction is based on, are those kind of, you know, kind of wish that, and maybe it did happen, who knows? But there's no evidence that it did happen.
That's phenomenal. That would be what a great piece of fiction that would be. For our listeners, Bill, and I
Yeah.
know so many people, and you probably are bored even telling this story, but I just for some of our listeners who just don't know the rest of the story of Jackie Robinson, give us like the Cole's notes of what happens to him after Montreal.
Yeah, he goes up to the Brooklyn Dodgers, and almost every season with them, they finish first. They go to the World Series. They're only successful in 1955. Um, in 1950, at the end of the 1957 season, the Dodgers leave Brooklyn and go to Los Angeles. And in a sense, I'll come back to Robinson's career in a minute, but in a sense, that ends the Montreal connection, because the Dodgers moved to LA meant that they wanted a farm team much closer to LA than Montreal was going to be. And so eventually, after the 1960 season, they basically give the franchise away, ironically, given the treatment he received there, ironically to Syracuse. And then they go on to a
Wow.
wonderful kind of story there under the guidance of Tex Simone. And that Canadian connection continues because that Syracuse team becomes, for over 30 years, the chief farm team of the Toronto Blue Jays. So they're intimately connected with their World Series wins. But Robinson in Montreal, he wins MVP awards. He steals home in a famous play where Yogi Berra probably claimed to his dying day that Robinson was out, but it was such a bold and daring move in the World Series. The umpire had to call him safe. I think it was one of those kinds of things. So, Robinson was part of that team in 1951 that lost to the New York Giants when they had a playoff for the pennant of the National League, and Bobby Thompson hits the famous home run in the ninth inning to win the pennant for the New York Giants. And the story is that Jackie Robinson was the only Brooklyn Dodger who did not leave the field. He stood there at second base, and he watched to make sure that Bobby Thompson touched every base. And if he didn't touch one of those bases, he was gonna, have an appeal play. Well, Bobby Thompson did touch every base, and I mean, it's another one of the great kind of trivia pieces of history that the guy on deck for the New York Giants was Willie Mays.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
and so, this idiotic golden rule thing that baseball talks about doing now, where you could bring whoever you wanted up to bat, at once in the game, which I don't think will happen, but nevertheless, crazier things have been done. What if the Giants had brought back Willie Mays up to the plate instead of Bobby Thompson? History would have changed. So
By the end of his career, is Jackie Robinson the catalyst for baseball saying, yep, we want black players to come into the Major League Baseball?
I think in the case of Robinson, there was always, a kind of a recognition, at least by some, not everybody. The Boston Red Sox were the slowest to recognize it, ironically. But there was a recognition that there's some great players out there, and we're not taking advantage of that. And so Bill Veeck in Cleveland is one of the first to, he in fact integrates the American League when he brings in Larry Doby. And of course, the Indians go on to win the World Series in 1948. And Satchel Paige is pitching for that team as well.
Yeah.
So there's a gradual, not perhaps as fast as one would have thought it would be, integration. Willie Mays comes along in the early 50s with the New York Giants. Hank Aaron moves up through the what was then the Boston Braves franchise to when they go to Milwaukee and leads them to a World Series in 1957. So there's a a slow, I think it's, if you looked at it historically, you'd say it's a slow but progressive phenomena. The New York Yankees, for instance, they don't really integrate until Elston Howard comes up from the Toronto Maple Leafs of the International League after his MVP season in 1954. So, many of these places are very, much slower than one would have thought, at the
Mm.
time. The Boston Red Sox are the last team to integrate with a guy named Pumpsie Green in 1959.
Mm.
Ironically, they integrate after the Boston Bruins integrate their National Hockey League team with Willie O'Ree the season before. So, there's some of these odd peculiarities of history that you look at and say, what the heck were they thinking?
Absolutely. And it's interesting. So clearly, slowly but surely, Jackie Robinson he kicks down the door, and then slowly but surely, other franchises follow. When you talk about Jackie Robinson, and when you think about his story and his time in baseball, what is his significance for Montreal as a city? What is the significance for that Quebec story that you've sort of been touching on?
The most significant thing, intriguingly, about the Jackie Robinson and Montreal story is that when Major League Baseball was thinking of expanding in 1968 to, with four teams, Walter O'Malley, the villain of the piece in Brooklyn who moved the team there, and again, this may be apocryphal, but there's probably some truth to it. He had such powerful and good, feelings for the city of Montreal and how they responded to Robinson in 1946 that he became a major proponent of Montreal getting an expansion franchise for the 1969 season. And considering that they were up against a lot of, other contenders, Buffalo thought they had it in the bag, for instance. A lot of people were shocked. Now, Montreal had just put on a successful Expo 67. They would go on, of course, to put on the Olympic Games. Um, and it's one of, I guess I would argue it's one of the great ironies of history that Expo 67 helped get the Expos, a part of Major League Baseball by virtue of the fact that O'Malley, came forward and was really a major proponent of putting a team in Montreal. But that very Expo 67 strength that led to that also led to the Olympic game near fiasco, and certainly that incredibly awful stadium they built in Montreal, which, one could make a pretty strong argument that that was a pretty significant factor in the team leaving Montreal and going to Washington. So, it is kind of the yin and the yang, as it were, of baseball that, what benefits you can also harm you as well. And hence, the loss of the Expos as a Canadian franchise is kind of one of our, great frustrations of sports history in Canada.
Always sad that the Expos left, and hopefully one day we can see them return. But I think it's great to it's great to understand that Montreal does have this significant and important place in baseball history because
Absolutely.
of Jackie's time there, but not just even Jackie's time playing there. And I know it was just 1 year, but this sort of moment in time where the Robinsons felt welcomed into a place that
Yep.
they didn't feel welcome in so many other places in North America. And
Yep.
arguably, there might not have been a city on the continent that would have welcomed them like Montreal did in 1946. What do you think of that?
Well, it's interesting. You could say, well, what about Toronto? Maybe Toronto would have been a welcoming place. Well, yes, Toronto, did not treat Robinson poorly, but in covering the game, they would often refer to and in quotes, I would say this colored colony of Toronto coming out to see Robinson play.
Right.
So they still saw him and the black population as outsiders, as people that weren't kind of, fully Torontonian, for want of a better term. Whereas Montreal was such an eclectic mix of people. Hugh McLennan, I think, wrote a book called Two Solitudes, but really one might say there were 8 or 9 solitudes in Quebec at that time. I mean, you had that disparity in the French Canadian community. You had rich Anglos and poor Anglos. You had a very large. In fact, they said that the third most spoken language in Montreal. What do you think it was? French, English, and
Greek or Italian?
Yiddish,
Oh, yes,
because
of
there were
course.
so
Of
many
course.
there were so many Jewish expats from
Yes, of
Eastern
course.
Europe, and they had their own community. I mean, that Mordecai Richler would,
Of
immortalize in Denny
course,
Kravitz
yes.
and places like that, right? That he that it was kind of, and it was an affluent, member of the Jewish community, Bronfman, who put up, and continues to be a major supporter of baseball, coming back to Montreal. So, those multiple solitudes meant that the black population was simply one more solitude. There wasn't this kind of uniform. Toronto was a much more uniform place in those days, right? It was, yeah, immigration had started. There was, a small Italian population in the city. It was often said that the Italians came to Toronto after the Second World War, believing the streets to be paved with gold. And when they got there, they realized not only were they not paved with gold, but they were doing the paving. So, there was that kind of, they weren't seen as kind of mainstream Torontonians, at that time. And so Robinson would have been a bit of an anomaly in the city, even in a place like Toronto. And, he may have been better received in Buffalo or Rochester. Who knows? We'll never know. But Montreal had that eclectic mixture of, quasi-legal enterprises all over the place, that kind of open city mentality, and just a diversity of peoples that, one more black guy like Jackie Robinson just kind of fit in where, say as did say an Oscar Peterson who got his start in Montreal at the very, very same time as Robinson was playing baseball. Peterson was playing, the piano in his little combo, and of course went on to great fame in the jazz world. And One Wishes, here's a second fictional piece, Oscar Peterson and Jackie Robinson, meeting for dinner one night in Montreal. I mean, there's a lot of great little things that we don't have any idea if they happened or not, and they probably didn't happen. But boy, you'd like to have thought they would have happened and would make such juicy pieces of, storytelling.
I want to thank you all for listening today. Don't forget, you can find us on all your podcast listening devices. You can also find us on Acast, on Patreon, as well as on Instagram and Facebook, just by searching Curious Canadian History. And folks, please do not hesitate to leave a rating and a comment wherever you get your podcasts. We love to hear from you. I'm David Borys. Stay curious, friends.